Well, howdy, everybody in Committed 100 land. Welcome to Systematic Theology with me. Hopefully my voice this week is a little bit better, but nothing a little bit of coffee cannot fix. Ka-chink. Hopefully you guys have your favorite drink this morning. Well, that's still really hot. But hopefully you also have your notebooks, pens, highlighters, paper, and most importantly, that you guys have your Bibles with you this morning as we continue looking at ecclesiology. How has God shaped and molded the church? How has he directed the church to function? What leadership has he placed in the church until his return? What is the God-given order of leadership? What are the gifts, talents, and abilities that God has given to the church to benefit the church? So with that, let us dive right into it, as this morning we will be specifically talking about evangelists and elders, and maybe deacons. We shall see. Well, with that, let's dive right in. It looks like everything's working. So as we talk about offices in the church, and officers of the church, this is one of the areas in modern Christianity that has maybe the most issues, because things have become so relative, that the denominational structure can assert or even replace biblical revelation. I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but the very fact that deacons in predominant churches are the ones really running the church, not the elders. And we're going to see how that can break the biblical model that God has set up. And then they become non-biblical churches. My big question has been, especially in the last several years, how many biblical churches do we have? If the deacons are running the board and run roughshod over the pastors / the elders, true biblical teaching elders, what is the church doing? Is it just playing church? Is it so hard to understand God's given direction? Is it so hard to understand not only God's design and order for the home, but God's design and order for the church? And because God's given design and order for the home is messed up, then of course we can't understand God's design for the church. Yeah, it sounds harsh. Yeah, it sounds hard, whatever. It's the reality of what we live in which some of you in the Committed 100 are going through in your own churches, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a leader, whether you're in the pews, so to speak. It affects everyone. So as we start looking at evangelists, so you might be asking, okay, Chris, why do you bring up evangelists? Aren't we all, in essence, evangelists? We've all been given the Great Commission to preach the gospel. And yet, when we look at Ephesians 4 and other passages, we see that there's this listing of a position called evangelist in the early church. Now, some churches and denominations still continue this tradition. In fact, the very first time I was asked to go out and go preach at a revival, they plastered on the poster board, "Oh, evangelist Chris Stewart." It's like, no. I'm not an evangelist. I'm just some dumb preacher, as the t-shirt is going around. Hey there, Malcolm. Good to see you. Good morning, D. Mrs. H. So when we look at the early church and we look at this idea of evangelists, as Burkhoff writes in his systematic theology, in addition to apostles and prophets, evangelists are mentioned. The evangelists that are mentioned in the Bible, Philip, Mark, Timothy, and Titus, were belonging to this class. We know that Timothy and Titus pastored. Philip and Mark being, shall we say, second generation disciples, second generation followers, and yet their role was not to be pastors. Their role wasn't to be or deacons. Their role was to preach, to bring the message. So we see a changing almost of the Old Testament role of the prophet in proclaiming the message of God. Now in the New Testament being the evangelist, bringing the Evangelion, the good news of the cross to the world. Now this class, I do not believe as a class, as a title, continues today. And the closest thing that we have in our modern day is what we would call missionaries, the sent ones. Technically, that title would be apostle, but the apostles, as we looked at last week, died out with Paul and John. So, in the New Testament, we actually don't see a whole lot about this class of people called evangelists. Very few people are given the title, and it doesn't seem to last beyond the first century. As we look in church history, post John, we don't see anybody credibly being given this title. And yet it has some type of resurgence in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's one of those questions is, why did it resurface? Once again, like with many things in church, some things don't need to be resurrected, such as the title of apostle, and in this case, evangelist. And we see in Acts chapter 21, we're going to look at some of these passages that deal with persons as evangelists. Acts 21, on the next day we departed and came to Caesarea, and we entered the house of Philip the evangelist. This is one of the rare occasions in which a title is given to Philip, who was one of the seven, and stayed with him. One of the seven, what is it talking about? One of the deacons. One of those appointed as a deacon, one who serves. But his gifting was also in evangelism, in being spiritually gifted to be able to bring the good news to his community. In Ephesians chapter 4, the passage we'll be continually referring to, and he gave the apostles, which, as we're looking at it today, in 2021, all the apostles are dead, long dead. The prophets ended with John. The evangelists ended in the first century. So then we have the shepherds and teachers, which we'll be looking at hopefully today, if not then next week. The shepherds and teachers. Notice there, though, before we get to shepherds and teachers, notice that the shepherds and teachers are contained in a single description. They are shepherds and teachers. Those are two different classes or two different titles. They're shepherd teachers, pastor elders. The two functions are contained within the same description. It's important for us to notice and keep that in the back of your minds if we get to elders today. 2 Timothy chapter 4, as for you, always be sober-minded and endure suffering. Do the work of an evangelist and fulfill your ministry. Well, we know Timothy was appointed as a pastor and he was a teacher, but he was also challenged to do the work of an evangelist, to continue the Great Commission. to continue to preach liberty to those held captive by their nature of sin. Is this necessarily, could we say Timothy the evangelist? I don't think so. I don't think the text gives us that right or ability. But his challenge from Paul is to do the work of, whether or not you have the title. This is the big thing that gets me in church. One of the big things is this amassing of titles. Everybody wants to be a deacon, but not do the work. Everybody wants to be a teacher, but not be a pastor. A lot of people want to be a pastor without being an elder. Well, amen to that, Malcolm. It's the big question, like Malcolm is pointing out. Do we love doing the work, no matter the title or position? That's the great question. That's why we need not to be hasty in laying hands on anyone, whether that is appointing them as deacons or appointing them as elder pastor teachers. And we're going to be looking in depth at the difference between the two. We need to be very careful. Way too many people out there with titles and quote unquote credentials. Just because you have a Bible degree or certificate doesn't mean you're called to be an elder pastor teacher or even a deacon. I think in reality, God is calling all of us to increase our knowledge of Him, degree or no degree. Now, may the studying push you forward towards knowing more about God? Yes. But that's not the qualification. I had an interview Tuesday night. And in this discussion with this church, the discussion came up, well, why should you be here as our pastor? And my answer is as the Spirit leads. I am called to be a pastor, but the big question is am I called to be your pastor? I'm called to do the work of an evangelist. I'm called to preach and to teach and to lead and to guide. But the big question is whether the Spirit is opening the doors at that specific location. And if the Spirit is then working in their lives to confirm that call. Now, side note. Actually, I'll leave that for our discussion of pastors/elders. Don't want to get ahead of myself here a little bit. But the big question is, are those that are called as pastors, like Timothy, doing the work of an evangelist? I hope so. But given the ministry needs, so much of the time and effort of the elder, of the pastor, is in serving the body, that sometimes the work of an evangelist then needs to be delegated and trained and honed in those willing to work and to serve and to come alongside the pastor and to help them in all areas of ministry. As we see these roles of evangelists, that they accompanied and assisted the apostles. This is why I think the office, shall we say, of evangelists ended with the apostles, because they were those that were called to preach, and they went together with those that were preaching. The apostles being the sent ones, and the evangelists being the ones who bring the message. And we're sometimes sent out by the apostles on special missions. We see that with Paul, right? with both Barnabas and Timothy. Their work was to preach and to baptize, but also to ordain elders and to exercise discipline. Their authority seems to have been more general and somewhat superior than that of regular ministers. It seemed to be a special temporary class of individuals during the early part of the church. In Titus chapter 1, Paul writes, "This is why I left you in Crete." Why? So that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. Well, we know Titus was an apostle. So where does that leave Titus? It leaves Titus as being this temporary position of evangelist, having delegated authority from Paul, an apostle. But you notice he's appointing elders. He's appointing the pastors in these churches as he goes. That's an authority above and beyond an elder, pastor, teacher. But he's not an apostle. So you see where this places us in having this quote unquote position of evangelist that I believe ends with the end of the apostles. 1 Timothy chapter 5. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, talking about ordaining of either deacons or elders, nor take part in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. What is Paul telling Timothy? Careful. Exactly, Malcolm. Malcolm says, in my different positions of service over the years, I first had to understand servanthood. Then I understood the position. One of the big things when I went to Hope International University is their big push is servant leaders. In fact, there's an entire class in which to graduate, you have to take a called servant leadership. And not being hasty. The big thing in church is, well, we've got a vacancy, so we need to fill it immediately. No. Don't be hasty. You need to know if those that are being called are qualified and being called of by God or not just the church. That once you've laid hands on somebody, you're responsible. One of the only times I've really seen a pastor break down and cry was I was at a Calvary Chapel pastor's breakfast in Downey. And Calvary Chapel was in the beginning of going through the big split between Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, and the rest of the Calvary Chapels. And for those of you that don't know, as a child, my parents took me to the Vineyard, which is in Anaheim. And Chuck Wimber was the founder of the Vineyard, and that absolute craziness. Well, it comes out in this meeting that the pastor that had ordained and laid on hands of Chuck Wimber totally just broke down and was sobbing and crying, regretting that he had ever approved of, laid hands on, and was a part of the ordination process for Chuck Wimber. Why? Because of what has followed since. The absolute cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs Pentecostalism that's in the Vineyard movement. If he was a little more careful, him and whoever else was on that ordination council, in understanding truly what maybe he believed and taught, maybe we wouldn't have the Vineyard as we understand it. That's why Paul is warning Timothy here, be careful. Don't just lay on hands because you need a deacon or you need a fellow elder at the church. Don't be hasty. One thing that our modern Christianity has absolutely no clue of. Oh, you have a Bible degree. Oh, let's ordain you. No. I don't think so. Now, when we shift from this idea of evangelists, we see that it ends as a position in the first century, but the duties, the responsibility of evangelism belongs to all of us, something that Malcolm has hammered in his series online on the role of discipleship and evangelism. We are all called to spread the good news, to in essence be evangelists. But we don't have the title, we don't have the position. There seems to be something different about those in the first century than those today. Still the same message. God's still using people to be the messengers. But we just lose the quote unquote title. If you're worried about a title, then you're concerned about the wrong things. Now, as we shift gears this morning and talk about elders, this is the one area in the last 2 centuries that has had the most change, that has had the most challenges, and has seen the most stripping of power, authority, and responsibility within the modern church. As Malcolm says, not just a warm body to fill a chair. Better to have one good qualified person than to have 15 people that are not called or qualified. Exactly. And, growing up, just go back on what Malcolm said. The little Baptist church my grandparents took me to. Up on the stage, they had 4 chairs. And they were the pastor's chairs. And I remember distinctly when they called me to be a pastor. I remember the senior pastor at the time was always trying to get me to sit in that doggone chair. I just wouldn't do it. I think I sat in that chair once because I was doing different parts of the service, announcements, and then prayer, and sit down, stand up, sit down, stand up. I think that's the only time I used that chair. Why was I so reticent about sitting in the chair? Because to me, it was about position. It was about title, not about what I do. I would rather be busy doing what I need to do rather than sitting in some chair. He wanted me to sit in the chair as to overlook the service while he was preaching. I was like, no. I can observe the service just as fine from a pew as I can from the chair. And to me, those type of things smack of religion more than anything. It's one of those things that maybe you guys might call me a rebel. I resist religion in all forms whenever possible. I had a conversation with a congregation member last night while driving out in his pasture. And I said, I only have 2 traditions, baptism and communion. And they're only that because they're commands. To preach, to teach, to baptize, and to remember the Lord's Supper. Anything else, normally for me, can sometimes smack of religion. Mankind coming up with all of his craziness. So we come to this position of elder. We've looked at a number of times in the Committed 100 the biblical basis for elders. Dr. Howard has exhausted 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus in his studies. as well as several series looking at the position. I don't want to rehash what Dr. Howard has already done. But let's look at some of the passages that have to deal with this position of elder in the New Testament and see if it matches up to what we're doing today. In Acts chapter 20, now from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church to come to him. Now we're not going to get into the original language of this. There are several words that discuss elders, both in the Old Testament and New Testament. In the New Testament, it is predominantly presbyteroi or presbyteros, one who looks over. Now, in the Old Testament, the term elder could refer to those that are advanced in age, looking up to the elders, those that are older than you, or those that are in charge as the elders. But predominantly in the New Testament, the term of elder is in reference to the pastor teacher, presbyteros, or in the plural, presbyteroi. In which, in each of these passages, it's dealing with the leadership of the church, those in whom we call today the pastors. So we see here in Acts chapter 20 that the elders of the churches were brought. Those that were in charge over individual congregations or multiple home churches were brought to have a discussion. Or we see in verse 28, pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock, in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, same word, elders, presbyteros, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his blood. So we see these overseers, these elders, these pastors. The synonyms here between overseers and pastors is contained here in verse 28. Pay attention to yourselves and the flock. Okay. So we are then the under shepherds. We see both in the Old Testament and the New Testament this concept of under shepherds. Those that are hired by the shepherd to help with the flock. That they have different responsibilities to help tend and care for the flock. They're not responsibilities in and of themselves. They're all delegated from the owner of the flock, who is the chief shepherd. That is where we get this concept of under shepherds. Notice here, though, we've already seen that the pastors, the overseers, the elders, are over the flock, not the other way around. This is where more modern understandings, especially 19th and 20th century ecclesiology, switches things around. With the rise of Congregationalism has come this reversing of roles, where the congregation often, yes, calls the pastor, but then runs roughshod over the pastor. Or worse yet, then the council of deacons, which, by the way, there's no such thing in the New Testament, has authority over the pastor. Yes, I believe in checks and balances, but not usurping the God-given authority of the under-shepherd. We don't see here in these two passages, and we're going to look at several more this morning, saying that the flock has authority over the pastor. It's the other way around. We don't see anywhere in here that the deacons, the servants, the waiters have authority over the pastors. No, it's the elders that called and appointed the deacons in the first place. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, we get another inkling of this position called elder, pastor, overseer. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of an overseer, he desires a noble task. If anyone desires to be a pastor, it is a good thing. but realize that it comes at a cost. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, we see in chapter 5 of 1 Timothy, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. We notice here that to be an elder is a good thing. It's a good desire. But there needs to be confirmation. There needs to be ordination. There needs to be a setting apart for the ministry. That is why they're worthy of double honor. Just as the under shepherds were paid to do the work, the elders, pastors, are worthy of double honor. What is that talking about? Double pay. Especially those that labor in preaching and teaching. Those whose main responsibility it is to teach. So what is verse 17 in chapter 5 teaching? A plurality of elders. In which, yes, one of the elders is going to need to be prima inter pares, one ahead of, or one leading others. But in the early church, there was a plurality of elders, in which we see many times, let's say a group of elders was over many different house churches, and we read of them, shall we say, sharing the flock, in which an elder would go visit other house churches that were underneath another elder to help them. That is why I really appreciate the Committed 100, because we see a plurality of elders assisting in this. It's a parachurch ministry outside of the church, but we see it benefiting multiple churches. That the elders that are teaching and preaching in the Committed 100 and that are involved benefit the whole body. In essence, the Committed 100 is a plurality of elders. But notice there the emphasis and the priority in verse 17 of those who labor in preaching and teaching. The one thing the modern church continues to strip away from the elder, the pastor, is the time, ability, and resources to focus their job on preaching and teaching. If they've been appointed as an overseer or an under shepherd, is to take care of the flock. How do they do that? In their preaching and teaching. Unfortunately, the majority of pastors are crunched for time. Why? Because the churches have made other things more important than prayer and teaching of the word. Well, wait a second. Time out, Pastor Chris. Acts chapter 6. The appointing of the 7. Why were they even appointed in the first place? So that the elders could labor in prayer, in study, and in preaching and teaching. But instead, what have we done? We've, in many ways, flipped the tables. It is the deacons that are ruling in many churches. And the elders are pressed for time serving and counseling and doing the day-to-day running of the church, and have less and less time for prayer and for preaching and teaching. To be totally honest, at least in my experience, maybe some of you guys can chime in on this, is that oftentimes study and prayer digs into my sleep time. Why? Because the deacons, or the so-called deacons, have pressed upon the pastors so many other duties and responsibilities that push out the time for prayer and for study. I have a stack of books to the left of me about preaching and teaching and about theology that I would love to get to. But the day-to-day in and outs at the church, more of what we would consider the waiting at the tables, the deacon's work, the diaconé, the servant's work, is pressed upon the elders. And so, those books are probably going to sit there for a little while. I would love to get to them. There's more studies I would like to do in the Committed 100 and elsewhere. But we only have so much time. In verse 19 of chapter 5 of Timothy, it mentions about not taking a charge against an elder except for the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. This is continuing a Jewish tradition as well as a commandment in the Torah of not taking an accusation except for having 2 or more witnesses. But this is to protect the elder, mainly against those, probably deacons, or just those in the church, one person who wants to cause problems. Romans chapter 10. Identify those causing dissension. Do not associate with them and kick them out. If one person's saying something, it's easily dismissed. If you have 3 or more people, there's more likely that really an investigation needs to begin to see if the charges are true. Notice here the judicial system within the church as to prevent things going to the secular courts. As Malcolm says, as a teacher, I have a great respect for what the pulpit represents. I choose to teach on the floor of the sanctuary or a classroom instead. Deacon, not dictator. Deacon, not dictator. But Malcolm, what's interesting with you, and I'm going to take a quick detour. Malcolm, I would say that since you obviously have a gift of teaching, and yes, you have been serving in the role of deacon, but because of the gifting as a teacher within the body, places you more in the role of a elder, not just because of your age, but because of your calling and gifting, than a deacon. Now, I have no authority or influence on what goes on at the church, but I would say if you were in my church, I would seriously sit down and have a conversation with you, and as well as the church, and see if there's a calling there as an elder within the body, as another brother laboring and teaching and in preaching. But that's on Brother Dave. So attention, Dave. Side note, hopefully your ears are burning. In Titus chapter 1, we also see the role of elders being brought up. This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. We looked at this earlier with the role of evangelists. But we notice there that the elders are appointed. Oh, wait a second. Is that what we do today? No, we go through a lengthy process of calling a pastor. But what about after the pastor, the senior pastor, is called by the church? What about the other elders in the church, the plurality of elders we see in the early church that should continue till today? Well, part of the problem is number one, very few churches have anyone qualified or called. For instance, in the 2 churches I currently serve, there's not another man that I feel is called to pastoral ministry, is called as an elder. Now, I believe there's 2 gentlemen specifically off the top of my mind that are called to be deacons and what that biblically entails. But that's it. Unfortunately, in the church, despite what you see in the Committed 100, which seems to be a glut with called and qualified men, in a lot of churches, you don't have that. But what you see in the church is that the elders are appointed by those either other elders or in the very early church appointed by the apostles themselves. So what happened? Why is it that other elders are not in the process of helping to appoint pastors to churches? Why is it churches aren't seeking out the other elders and going, do you feel that this man is called and qualified to be our elder or one of our elders? Well, wait, isn't in the Old Testament that the prophets were subject to the prophets? Doesn't that continue in the New Testament? The other elders are then, in other words, checked in place by other elders. Yeah. But where is that in the 19th and 20th centuries? Devoid. In verse 7 in Titus chapter 1, for an overseer, as God's steward, must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered, or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain. And the passage goes on. I'm not here to rehash Dr. Howard's teaching on 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. But an overseer, this position as elder, presbyteros, is this position as a steward of God's flock, but able to teach and laboring in preaching and teaching. Yes, and you're right, Malcolm. Malcolm says congregations need to understand the more we train others to serve and to work together, the more time the pastor has to spend in prayer and in the word. Yep. Period. That's what we see in Acts chapter 6. That is what it was consistent in the first 2 centuries of the church. But once we get the peace of the church in 311 and the secularization and the expansion of the church in the 3rd century, we get more of these aberrations of what God has designed and a shifting, not biblically, of what elders and deacons do. In 1 Peter chapter 5, we also see elders in the essence of those that give oversight. In modern understanding, and I used to manage restaurants for a living, the responsibilities of the different levels of management is vastly different. When you are a manager of the managers, when you are the restaurant manager, as they often call it, or the senior manager, your job is to train and to be over the other managers that run the more of the day-to-day things, or maybe their specific duties, is maybe one who's in charge of ordering, purchasing, and inventory, and another is the kitchen manager, and the other one is the front of house manager. In many ways, there's parallels in the church. The elder, the singular elder, the senior pastor, is then over the other pastors, one among brothers, but one maybe having more experience, being able to lead and to guide the other elders in the care of the flock. Then also to be able to give oversight to the deacons, who are the ones serving the tables. This is something also on Tuesday I was talking of church, that the role of pastor should be the one to first train and equip the other elders, to disciple the deacons, and then in turn then as they're discipling others in the church, providing guidance and understanding and counsel as they are discipling others. It's not my responsibility to disciple everybody. I disciple the disciplers. That's how it really should work. But once again, 19th and 20th centuries has flipped that structure around. So I exhort the elders among you. Peter exhorting as an apostle, exhorting the elders of the churches. As a fellow elder, so Peter was both an apostle and an elder. He was in charge over a specific group of individuals. And a witness of the sufferings of Christ, he's presenting his qualifications as an apostle, as well as a particular in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, authority, exercising your rights and duties and delegated authority as under shepherds. Not under compulsion. You don't give orders. It's not a battleship. Or not as though you are under compulsion, but willingly, wanting to serve what God would have you to do. Not shameful for gain. In other words, you don't want money, but eagerly. We see the presbyteroi are first mentioned in Acts chapter 11, but the office was evidently well known already when Paul and Barnabas went to Jerusalem, and may have been in existence even before the institution of the diaconate, which I agree would be true. Acts chapter 6 implies that elders existed before the deacons so that they could focus on preaching and teaching. The whole point of the diaconate was to serve, to relieve the pressures on the elders. At least the term he netroi in Acts 5 seems to point to a distinction between the elders and the deacons. Frequent mention is made of them in the book of Acts. I'm not going to go all into the different verses, or else, this would be a 4-part series just on elders. To really dig into that, if you want to dig into Dr. Howard's presentation of 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. In Acts chapter 14, we see, and when they had appointed elders for them in every church, with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. In other words, ordination. The big fancy word we use today. And in chapter 15, verse 6, we see the apostles and the elders were gathered together to consider this matter. So the apostles having preeminence, more authority than the elders, but the elders were also, shall we say, consulted about the matter at hand, as being those in charge over their individual congregations. Also in chapter 15, we read further down in that same chapter, then it seemed good to the apostles and to the elders with the whole church to choose from among them and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And they sent Judas called Barsabbas and Silas, leading men among the brothers. So these were fellow servants to come alongside and to help Paul and Barnabas in their mission. But it was delegated authority from who? The apostles and the elders. Since there are no apostles today, what do we have left? We have the elders, which seems to be countercultural, especially in the last couple of centuries, with deacons and boards running amok over the elders, which is backwards. It's an upside down pie, or it's what is it? What are those fruit things called that like upside down tart, excuse me, where the crust is on the bottom and the filling's on the top, is what we've done with the order. Not only we see in Acts, but 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus between the elders and the deacons. Acts chapter 20. Now from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church to come to him. And pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, elders, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his blood. These officers clearly had the oversight of the flock that was entrusted to their care. They had to provide for it, govern it, and protect it as the very household of God. This is delegated authority, delegated responsibility that in our modern times has been stolen from the pastors and placed into those that were just called to serve tables. It's a sad commentary. Because why? Because mankind does, much in the same way, mankind doesn't want to give up their quote-unquote free will and to realize that God is the only free moral agent. God is the only one with true autonomous free will. In the same way, mankind, as the congregation or even the deacons, do not want to give up of authority and responsibility, but instead take on it. As I've told you before, my friend Pastor Chris from Wool and I have said that the God-given form of authority in the church is a benevolent dictatorship from the pastor or pastors, if there's a plurality of them, not the quote-unquote boards that we have pressed upon us today. Paul's statement in Ephesians 4 that the ascended Christ also gave pastors and teachers a singular position with two responsibilities, mentioned as a single class to the church, clearly shows that these two did not constitute two different classes of officers, but one class having two related functions. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, we saw that it speaks of elders who labor in the word and in teaching. And according to Hebrews 13:7, we're also teachers. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, we also see that Paul urges upon Timothy the necessity of appointing to the office faithful men which shall also be able to teach others. We're getting close to the end of our time this morning before we go to looking at Finneyisms. But the important point here is that Timothy was told to appoint others. So Timothy, as the pastor, is appointing other pastors that share in the office and in the teaching, to find faithful men qualified, 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus chapter 1, to share in the presbyteroi, the eldership of the church. But unfortunately is, I don't know if Timothy was necessarily successful in finding others. Notice there the primary difference, as we see in 1 Timothy chapter 3. What is the main difference in responsibility between deacons and elders? Is elders have to be able to teach, apt to teach. Literally the words 1 Timothy chapter 3. And Timothy's charged with finding faithful men who shall also be able to teach others. That this continuation of elders helping other elders learn and understand their God-given gifts, talents, and abilities in serving of the body. In the course of time, the two circumstances led to a distinction between the elders or overseers that were entrusted only with the government of the church and those that were called upon to teach. This is where I disagree with Burkhoff. This is where the Presbyterian system of governance comes into play. I disagree that the government of the church is still in the pastorate. That yes, the deacons take more of the day-to-day serving, but the decisions, the calling the shots, shall we say, because the pastor is the one who is ultimately in control, in charge, because he's been not only delegated the right and authority, but because he is the one going to be held responsible. How can I be the one held responsible for decisions if I'm not the one making them? This has been a sticking point for me the last 2.5 years, is being held responsible for decisions that I didn't make. Next week, we're going to be looking at this idea of pastors as teachers, not just those in oversight, and then on into deacons. With that, I hope that you're blessed. I hope you go back to Dr. Howard's series on 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus to get more of the background and specific application of these passages. But this is, once again, a overview, and specifically looking at the God-given order of pastor, elders, deacons, and the congregation in their role within the body. With that, stay tuned for just a moment for looking at the craziness of Finneyisms.